Why do you offer allegiance to a king who has betrayed you?" They were at a clearing now, far into Strathclyde. Osric had not wanted to open her eyes as they fled Caerliguilid. Flames and Eric had ridden the chestnut mare by only cold moonlight, as she clung onto her clothes and sword. Now, as day broke, they had stopped by a river. Eric Thurgilson had stripped himself of all his clothes and immersed himself in it as Osrath looked around her, wondering where they were. North, of course. But where would this land take them to Dunnottar? How long would that take? Longer than if she travelled alone. Osric knew. Had her benevolence in asking for his freedom cost Domhnall his crown after all? For, there was no doubt that Greogair, Giric, was planning an alliance with Cumbraland to overthrow him in the depths of winter. A plan, that was what they needed. But Eric had not shared his own plan, and Osric suspected she knew what he sought, or, rather, who. She heard splashing, which suggested the Northman was emerging from the water, and she glanced to check she was right, as he unfolded more underclothing from his leather breeches. Finoli. How much she had wanted to see him since he had disappeared at Tara. The longing had slowly faded, until recently when, if her mind flicked to him, she would be hoping in an abstract way that he was safe, that he thrived. And so, it seemed, he was safe and thriving in Caerliguilid. How much she did want to see her best friend again, spend time with him, talk, laugh as they used to. "You wished to stay," said Eric's voice by her shoulder. Osric turned round, and nodded. "There was not time," she replied. "He risked a good deal for me as I once risked a good deal for him." Eric nodded, clipping his belt around his waist. Then, Osric turned, looking at the clean Northman. It was often said they bathed more than Saxons, and certainly more than Scots. Though he had told her he came from a far colder place than Northumbria, still he bathed where Saxon, Cymry and Scot resisted. His hair was unbound, and he was using a bone comb to smooth it around his shoulders. "You," he said, holding out his hands. Not sure of his meaning, she handed him the clothes Finoli had given to her. Eric placed them on the ground, then held out his hands again. "You wash," he clarified. But Osric shrank back, as she tried to hide body inside the cloak for shame of what had become of it. "And how?" Eric lowered his eyes. "I will not look, if that is your worry. But, if you would have me help you, it may be easier." Slowly, he took a step forward, and Drew put her arms. Ugly, congealed gashes were stuck to the once beautiful silk dress. Osric looked away. What they did was not honorable. He got what he deserved. Finoli is a magnificent fighter. "You miss him, your friend?" "Yes." Osric looked back to Eric, as he carefully lowered her arms. "He was once Domhnall's man, the king, but his king betrayed him, I'm guessing." Eric's face looked grim. "His lover betrayed him, in order to be king. And you wish to go back?" "This king did the same to you." "He may have," Osric conceded, considering the water. "But I swore an oath. It would be cold. But, at least she would be rid of Caerliguilid." Stay with us, if it's fighting you want." Osric smiled, hoping he thought she was grateful for his suggestion. In all honesty, she was. And now, he had confirmed his plan. "I couldn't do the rest," Osric admitted, "not ravage women, not murder children, not take pennies from people who are already poor, steal their cattle, burn their homes. Pity. You could teach the upstart pups of our a few things." Osric shook her head. "I am of Cumbraland and Northumbria, Alba." "I would be attacking her own people." She looked at Eric. "I thank you." "Ha." Osric smiled at the Northman's grin as she began to untie her cloak. The air was cold. Grey clouds were accumulating. Get back to Domhnall and tell him the ally he thought he had in Greogair actually desires the throne for himself. She remembered that part. The usurper, as Giric, had let it slip when he was mauling her cunt. Unless he was dead, she would have to see his corpse to believe that. Eric helped her peel off the fabric where it had dried to her skin with blood, throwing the remnants of cloth onto a fire that he had begun. He had not sought to molest her. Indeed, his fingers had been light, efficient, methodical of task. It seemed a measure of respect. Osric could trust him, for now. And she had his bargain to consider. As Eric turned and made his way to the horse, She walked over the hard earth and into the water, anticipating the coldness. The water stung her injuries and she gasped at the temperature. At least, that was what she told herself, as water swirled around her calves, her thighs, waist, neck. Eric was busying himself with the horse's leather straps, his back to her as she pulled ferns from the moorland hedgerow that was growing beside the water to clean the dirt from her skin. More she used on her hair, and she blushed for shame to see her own body, clean, naked, damaged. "I am not dressed yet," Osrith warned the Northman as he made to turn to her, and she put her hands to her chest in alarm as she emerged from the lake. He knew she could fight, if he was thinking to overpower her, and Osrith had glimpsed the wounds she had given the Norseman on the battlefield as he had emerged from his bathe. In his hands, however, the Northman was holding strips of cloth. He waited patiently as she pulled her cloak to her. "You look like a woman. You have tits." He cupped his hand over his own chest. "That will distract a man, but not for long, and then you are really in trouble." "Take off your cloak." Osrith gave him a look, and did not move. "I will do nothing, except show you something." He offered the cloth to Osrith. "While I am Norse, and am everything you describe a Norseman to be, thief, murderer, rapist, I do not wish more shame to come to you." He looked at her face as he proffered the bindings, holding out a hand. Osrith remained as she was. "You gave me the choice of freedom. I have an obligation." "A geese," Osrith said. "An obligation." One formed with a magical being. Domhnall was not the only man she sought at Dunnottar. "You are every bit a warrior as I, woman, better than many Saxons or Britons." "I am a Briton, and an Angle," Osrith retorted as he placed the clean pieces of cloth beside her shirt. "I am a Gaelish warrior, and every bit as clean as a Norseman or Dane." Eric Thorgilson grinned at that, placing the binding strips upon Bué before turning and busying himself with the horse's straps. Osrith stood up, easing off her thin wool covering, and spent the next minutes trying to loop them around herself. It was no good. "Stop being a gentleman and show me how to do this, then," Osrith declared. "Nagabdra, I will pull your intestines out of your ass if you try anything." When Eric turned, he saw her. Osrith was standing, naked, arms outstretched. He had seen her naked before, in the moonlight when she was being molested, and had tried not to look. However, there was no avoiding her body now. "I will try not to harm your injuries," he said, as he strode over, putting his hand to her right breast. Osrith gasped. She had made a mistake. She was sure he was going to push her down and force himself into her, but the Northman placed one end of cloth under her breast and drew up her hand to hold it in place. "You were very brave to endure what he did to you. You should turn, on the spot," he added, and when Osrith turned, the cloth pulled her breasts inwards. It was not as uncomfortable as Osrith had imagined. Already she had more agility in her upper body. "Each day pull it in a little tighter, not so much you can't breathe. Our women do this, to stop weapons getting in the way." Eric put his hands on her waist. "For your hips, nothing can be done. Padding on your waist. A long jerking perhaps." He carefully wrapped the last of the linen around waist, efficiently and matter-of-factly, as if binding the leg of a lame horse. "Done," he concluded, looking away, before stopping and turning back, eyes on the bundle of clothes Finoli had pressed to her before their flight. He handed it to her. Osrith blushed a little at his show of honor. Around them, snow began to fall. Osrith realized it was her shirt, her clothes, given to her by Domhnall, which Finoli had made the effort to launder. She missed her friend. Then, she saw the roll of cloth, which must have been in the very center of the clothes, and her heart lurched. Finoli had sent them with food. Eric had, meanwhile, taken up her cloak and was rubbing the end of it with more fern. "It will dry as we ride," he said, as a now fully dressed Osrith appeared beside him. "You have a good body," Eric said approvingly, as he helped Osrith onto the horse. "Very nice." He pushed with effort to mount, too. The horse moved her back legs for stability as Eric shifted in the saddle behind her. "I don't care," replied Osrith, pulling the woolen cloak around her shoulders as Eric reached past her and to the reins. His body was warm, a thing for which Osrith was grateful as more snow began to tumble from the dark. grey sky. You have good hands. I didn't fall off this blessed horse. She was getting better, but Osrith knew she would never be comfortable on a horse. Eirik was about to set off, but stopped, and Osrith found her hair being pulled. She saw Eirik's hand and the comb he had used for his long, fair hair. A comb through her hair. That man, Griotgeir, caught you up by the hair, the Norseman said, smoothing through his comb. When he was pulling you to the dungeon, he worked over her scalp, drawing all the strands together. I have seen many men pulled by their hair in battle, to their end. The comb snagged, and Eirik extracted something from Osrith's hair. He placed it in her palm. It was the silver hair slide, his, with the moon-like pearl set into it. The one she had used to free the cell door and the gate. It is fine, Osrith agreed. It is yours, Eirik said, quietly. Both the silver and jewel came from your land, and was worked by a blacksmith there. His deft fingers braided her hair into one short bunch and he pushed the piece into it. Here, Osrith returned. How did you get bread, woman? Osrith glanced over her shoulder and took it back. Eirik sighed. Warrior, he emphasized. Anglish, Gaelish pain in the arse. Osrith grinned, pushing a generous portion into his hand. Osrith, she said, of Northumbria. You may call me that. Eirik Thurgilson, the Norseman said, of BJS Rvine. He took a bite of the dark loaf. Finoli. Osrith sighed. She couldn't help it. Bewildered for most of the night that her friend had appeared, this was now giving way to a feeling of contentment. Osrith had managed to help him, and he lived well as a monk. You have true friend, Eirik said, as he turned the horse back to the snow-covered path. Osrith's mind went to her friend, one long braid down his back, soft, brown eyes, arm as steel. And there, before her waking eyes, as if going on in front, Osrith could see the four of them, her, Fergus, Finoliant, riding together. They were all Domhnall's men, had sworn to him. She would go to Alba. Wait. Eirik drew the horse to a stop. She turned round as much as she could to look at the Northman's face. It was likely she had little choice anyway, for what Osrith was about to say, the Norseman may have decided to do anyway. But it was important she said it. I agree to your terms. I agree, she swallowed, for safe passage to Dunnottar. I would show you the way. She held out a hand. Eirik said nothing. He stared at her, and her hand. Then roared a laugh, grasping her hand with both of his own. To honor of battle, Osrith, he declared, then moved the leather straps in his hands and reined the horse on. 88,888,888. Snow began to drift down in clumps from the sky when Eirik Thurgilson pulled Osrith closer to him. Before he even had to, she knew what he was going to say. Prepared? He asked in English. Osrith drew his saddle hand across her torso until it touched hers, which was now gripping Buey. And she was off, first, landing up to her ankles in freshly fallen snow, raising her sword as Eirik swung their black mare around. There were two of them, one plump, a man around Osrith's height, the other was much taller, and he held a blunt-looking axe in his hand. They were coming to rob them, and they must be desperate. Osrith deduced no attacker would ever come out on an evening like that to attack people on a horse. Cymri? Osrith asked. Neither answered, but their faces betrayed them. She and Eirik were far into Strathclyde territory. People lived far from the sea on poorer land. Even if they hadn't met Norse, and Osrith supposed, by coming north Eirik knew roughly where his brother and their army would be, a bad harvest could easily turn them into rivers. I know where he will be, Eirik replied, after Osrith had asked, after the Cymri had run. An hour later, not risking two warriors and swords apiece with merely tree branches with which to defend themselves. It had been a pity, Osrith thought as their horse picked out an otherwise invisible path in the snow, not missing her hooves once she could have done with letting her energy loose. She silently thanked Finoli for providing them with a horse who knew her way through Strathclyde. Osrith wriggled in the saddle a little with cold as a late afternoon wind buffeted them. To their right, the setting sun illuminated a hillfort which Osrith knew to be called Trusty's Hill, from the documents at Caerleguilad and a line drawing. We will rest there, It is a cave in its hill. You may eat better there. They did eat better there. The hill fort consisted of a ring of mounds surrounding a central one, which had a hollowed-out center. Inside was perfectly dry and, as Osrith tied the horse and pulled the riding blanket over her back, Eric appeared with 2 handfuls of salted rabbit. The salt comes from the wellies, he explained as Osrith strove to light a fire. Even shielded by the hill, the low temperature meant any fire she did start was going out almost immediately, and she continued to feed the fire with dry sticks that she found tucked away at the back of the hill cave as Eric cooked the animals until their juices ran clear, crackling into the fire. He passed a long, thin, hot steak to Osrith and she ate it with big bites, knowing the last time she had consumed hearty food had been the night before she had been tricked to the altar. God be thanked, Osrith was away from Caoligwylid now. Where they were going, that was the next question, and, Osrith considered, she could be in as much trouble with this Norseman than with Griog and Abbot True. But it didn't feel it. He had gone with her, willingly. She had more of a chance surviving with her nominal enemy. We make our camps here regularly, Eric explained, as he bit hungrily into his own rabbit. Osrith realized their strategy. Having several stashes of dry wood and fuel, the Norse could traverse quickly across land and keep strength in Orug to fight and defeat Saxons, Britons, Picts. Dimming light reflected off the beginnings of a river which was trickling through high ground to the west. Eric got up to tether the horse in shelter and she watched as he held out corn which he had recovered from the saddlebag, wrapped in cloth. Finoli again, and Osrith's heart softened to an ache as she thought again of her friend. If he had been clever enough to help her escape, he would have been clever enough to ensure that his role was not discovered. Osrith's eyes closed to a scene of white flakes heading swiftly downwards. It was not so cold, and the snow was fluffy and light, and in the morning it should be easy to ride through, past the small glen which would eventually be the Clyde and get to Glashku. They would be travelling northeast, towards Dunnottar and to the Norse. Osrith and Eric settled down to sleep, back to back in the warm earth dugout. Osrith's conscience was troubled by her selfish agreement. If the Norse won, she would have betrayed Domhnall. Her mind drifted to Tagged, and she shivered, and not from the cold though she wrapped her cloak around her tightly, but at the image of her handsome, hand husband, warrior at arms. It was selfish to bring the Norse to Domhnall, but she would have safer passage, and see Tagged again, and tell her Lord of Griog. The soft twilight faded to blackness. There were no stars, presumably snow clouds were still shedding their burdens. Osrith shuffled to get comfortable on the hard floor. Her injuries, though healing, were sore. Eric moved away until she was still again. "Did you really fight Norse?" he asked. "Yes." "And you were there whenever Lothbrokson was killed?" "Domhnall killed him." It was still difficult for her to think of him as King Domhnall. "I killed the man aiming for Domhnall, and he swung and Ivar was slain." "That makes us enemies, then, as well as allies." "Allies until we reach Dunnottar," Osrith agreed. "This may be Trusty's Hill, a place ancestors of this land lived. If so, we are 2 days from Dunnottar." "And it will be Yule," Osrith told herself, "and in the snow and the cold there will be a battle." Osrith awoke to thick snow piles outside. Beyond, she saw legs pacing outside, and the sticks from the structure she had made on which to cook the rabbit the night before. She sat up, smiling as she slid off Eric's cloak from over her own. It was hard to know their direction in the whitescape. They were indeed at a hill fort, north of Strathclyde. It might well be Trusty's Hill, and Osrith imagined her ancestor, Urien, striding around here, inspiring his warriors to war, to join with the Picts, against the Angles at Kettrich. She stumped across to Eric, who was readying the horse, and offered him his cloak back. "I've called her Slipner, Odin's horse," Eric explained, slipping it around his shoulders. Slipner had 8 legs and was as swift as the wind. "We will have to be swift in this weather." It must have been an important sight, Osrith's mind insisted, as Eric helped her up, for Pictish carving in rock was exposed where Eric trod his boot, just like the line markings at Dund, and the rocks kept at Dunnottar that Constantine had stopped her from seeing. They rode northeast, the sun coming out behind them, melting the snow a little and making Sleipnir's way easier. "My brother will want to hump you," Eirik warned, his beard touching Osrith's shoulder and face as Sleipnir moved up a gradual incline. "What of our agreement?" Osrith demanded, shocked. "I will tell him you sleep beside me. He will not understand our agreement." As they rode they talked a little. Eirik told of Norway, a hard, frozen land for many months with only a short growing season. The reason for raiding, to Osrith, was obvious. "We had a little sister," Eirik continued. "Sister, died of fever. Bright, lovely." He fell silent and Sleipnir the sure-footed took them further north. "What was her name?" Osrith asked at length. "Jida. When Siegfried first went Viking and I was too young, we played. She was close to me in age." He laughed, remembering. "She always won when we played sword fighting. She was too quick. Her hair was bright yellow, it shone in the daylight. She always laughed at me for being too slow." "Nothing made her slow." Eirik pulled on Sleipnir's reins as they descended a slope. "I went Viking with Siegfried, my first time. When we got back, Jida was dead." Osrith thought of a fair-haired girl fighting with her brother, and smiled to herself. "Maybe if Utad had not been betrayed by Elfric it could have been them." "I do so hate to ravage," Eirik continued. "I think of Jida, what she would feel like if it had happened to her." They rode on. Snow flurried in the air, yet the sun was still out, yet weak. The flakes were melting before they landed. "I have a brother, somewhere," Osrith replied. When Eirik asked about her family it couldn't hurt and she stuck to her old lie. "My family died before dawn, not a fortress under the blades of the Norse. I got lost and ended up in King's household." "When was this?" "More than 2 years ago," Osrith admitted, falling back towards Eirik as Sleipnir headed up to higher ground, and bore her legs into the horse's flank, flailing a little for the rein. Eirik steadied her with his arm. Horses. Osrith still was not skilled enough with them. "Ivar, it my gut may have been him, or Harald Finehair, but he usually raids the east coast. I rescued Constantine, King's son. He has hated me for it ever since." "Men are like that," Eirik said, by her ear. "They do not like to be shamed by a woman." "I am a man, I would be a man," Osrith declared. She could do what a man could, better than many men. "You are a man to me though your body tells otherwise. You endured those terrible things to your body by people who were supposed to be your allies. But, then never broke your mind. You are like a Norse warrior." And, in that very cold day, as the sun began to sink, a burning pride at Eirik's compliment glowed within Osrith of Bibbenberg. 88,888,888. As the sun began to set, Osrith could see fire on horizon. Eirik was slowing and she could feel Sleipnir's sides moving in and out. The horse had worked hard for them on that cold day and deserved the rest that she would receive. "Is that your brother and your army?" Osrith asked. Eirik said nothing at first, but slowed more. "There will be lookouts, and we will have been seen." But Osrith saw no lookouts. No man stopped them as they neared, and they were allowed to ride into view of the tents which were pitched in a circle at the very center. It seemed obvious to Osrith why they were allowed to ride straight to the camp. Few men were surrounding the Norseman in the center of the group who was now riding out to meet them. Their number had been severely reduced, and Osrith did not think it was as a result of their attack at Caligulid. They must have thought since and lost more. "Siegfried!" Eirik roared in pleasure at the sight of his brother and slipped from the saddle. "Stay here," he whispered to Osrith in English, handing the rein to a Norseman, as tall and as broad as Eirik, who held an axe and looked up to Osrith. Snow had begun to fall again and she pulled her cloak around herself again, noticing the Norse warrior was looking at her sword with interest. Osrith looked across to Eirik, who was in intense conversation with his brother. They looked across to Osrith, and laughter drifted across to her. At the same time, she felt a hand by Bué slapping out. She hit the Norseman holding the rein, who was trying to steal her sword. He made to hit her back, but Osrith ducked and he hit Sleipnir's bridle instead. "Bitch!" But Osrith had slipped off Sleipnir's back and had withdrawn Bué. In turn, the Norseman had withdrawn his. "Edderkop!" Eirik exclaimed, slipping an arm around their warrior's shoulder. "What did she do?" "She moved," Edderkop replied, staring with hatred at Osrith. He tried to steal my sword. Osrith replied, matching the warrior's glare. Leave her, Eirik commanded, pushing him away. Oh, my brother, if she has been offended, she must fight the spider, Siegfried suggested, a grin forming on his face. Fight? Thought Osrith. She gripped Buey. Later, Eirik said, lowering Osrith's sword, pushing Edakop away by the chest. I hear you refused to leave without my brother, Siegfried said, looking her up and down. True. And now I have no hostage with whom I can guarantee peace between us and King Guthard. Then fight him again, Osrith replied. I am no longer there, nor King Domhnall's guards. They are ill-trained. You will find it much easier this time. Siegfried broke into a body-shaking laughter, raising up his right hand, his sword hand, and Osrith felt her heart quicken. For, instead of a hand, the Norseman had bound a blade. With the other, Siegfried Thorgilsson clapped Eirik on the shoulder. I agree, my brother, he laughed, looking at Osrith again. A warrior who will be useful. A warrior who thinks, who knows the king's lands and is vengeful enough to allow us to take it. He turned to Eirik. Well done, my brother. As always, you turn up gold when you've lost silver. But Osrith was still looking at the edged weapon that was in place of his hand. A bastard, by the name of Ragnarsson, did this. It is why we lost in Alba. And you are going to help us avenge the bastard Simri who killed half my men, as we take Alba as our own. This time, it was Osrith's shoulder that Siegfried had clapped, with his left hand. You have a name. More flakes of snow floated down around them. Osrith Lackland, she replied. And she will be our key to Dunnottar, home of the Scots. Looks like a very pretty key. Siegfried's hand drifted from her shoulder to her face. And she is under a truce in exchange for protection. She will show us the way to Dunnottar. Siegfried took his hand away, his eyes never leaving Osrith's, and snorted. She was betrayed and wishes to return to her king, Eirik replied. She saved my life, Siegfried. You are loyal to your lord, though he betrayed you? He looked across to Eirik, and sighed. Another sparrow to tend, like when we were children. I do not know that he did betray me, Osrith replied. I do know a lord he believes to be an ally is a traitor to him, and I must tell him of this. You love men, Siegfried declared. Osrith took a step towards the Norse leader. Buey was still in her hand. I kill men. If your number was not so reduced, I would gut your Edakop, who tried to steal from me. This time, Siegfried did not laugh. Instead, he stepped towards her, quickly, feeling over her body with his one hand. She is just a child, Eirik, he reported, as Eirik stiffened. No curves to her at all. Keep her a year or so and she will fill out. I may take her before you, brother, eh? Siegfried grinned, looking over Osrith's outraged face. My brother is a delicate lover. By then you might want a vigorous Norseman inside you, eh? He stepped back, and laughed. Eh? He said to his men, who had gathered around that evening's spectacle. They laughed and Siegfried roared with laughter. But Eirik had already taken Siegfried by the shoulder a few steps away, pushing the older brother aggressively, bending his head in animated conversation. Moments later, and it was over. Eirik stalked across to Osrith. She lowered Buey. We are in agreement, he said. Siegfried agrees to our bargain. And what did you agree? Asked Osrith, shrewdly. But it was the leader who answered. We agreed, Page, that your honor, your life is preserved, while you show us the way to the fortress of the king of Alba, whoever he may be when we get there. Siegfried laughed again, and turned to his Norseman. Be with my warriors, Osrith Lackland, who endured treachery by her own people when she showed nothing but loyalty. Who might have left Eirik, my brother, to slaughter but chose to free him too. He took a step towards Osrith, then took up her arm. She is Norskvind. You will not touch her. If you do, Osrith added, silently, it will be the last thing you do. Murmurs of Bige and Kvind began in the men round Siegfried until he shouted, while she is with us, she pays her way as a warrior. Of you Ragdast Norse pups. He slashed his hand blade in the air before the young warriors. Krieger, Hanner Etgringer. Hanellahan, Eirik. Cautioned Siegfried. Hanner Norge Krieger. Eirik declared, giving his brother a sidewards glance. We will begin July early. Siegfried Thorgilsson declared, his arms announcing celebration while his eyes were cold, fixed, on Osrith. For, with this warrior's help, we are to win on the battlefield in Alba. A whole country is within our grasp. Alba, and what we seek is the throne of Alba. So, that was it. These Norse brothers, with monstrous ambition and the arrogance to attempt it, were not just after land, or money. They wanted the throne that Domhnall, and with him, Tagged, Fergus and, indeed Finolai, had given so much to achieve. And she was to lead them straight to Dunnottar's door. Osrith felt her heart chill, but then a thaw set in. King had defeated Ivariochade with Giric had managed to withhold these brothers' army. There was no need to despair. This is so, is it not? In the same way Osrith had sought clarification, Siegfried wished her to confirm it, with her own mouth. Buer was still in her hand. She set her mouth and thrust her blade towards the hard ground, before Siegfried aimed Eric. I swear I will lead you to Dunnottar, and you are my lord until then. A roar of approval rose from the warriors. Then we feast, for it is Julnat. Julnat, thought Osrith as she strode to the center of the camp beside Eric. As snow softly fell around them, as flakes sizzled in the sunken mire, Osrith realized it was the night before Christmas.